I actually started my career as a sergeant in Singapore's fire and rescue organization before moving to the US the second time. Look, as a mechanical engineer, I never thought I'd be working for KFC. Hand on heart, I can say that, but it's been an absolute privilege to not only spend time here at the global level, but also have had the career transitions as well. One of the things that my father told me when I first got into McKinsey, and I really felt on top of the world because it was such a hard place to get into, and look, it doesn't matter what job title you have or how much money you're earning, but the greatest satisfaction or sense of fulfillment that you have is the opportunity and when you're able to help others. And I see it. The human is more resilient than you think. It's funny because growing up, when we were going through a lot of these changes, my father would often use the elastic band terminology, where you stretch the elastic band to a certain point and you hold it there. And that is its new norm.
You're listening to the East Meets West Pakistani Professional Journeys podcast, released bi-weekly every Sunday at 5 p.m. on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple iTunes. Welcome to the East Meets West Pakistani Professional Journeys podcast. Today we have Arham Junaid, who's completed his bachelor's in mechanical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. Some of the many companies Arham has worked include Tesla, McKinsey, and KFC. He's currently working as a principal in global strategy and digital at KFC. He's lived in 5 different countries, which provides a unique perspective in adapting to new environments, professionally and personally. He's also determined to give back to the community by sharing his advice to professionals and through the keynote speaking he's done in universities, as well as other volunteer mentoring initiatives. Thank you, Aaron, for being on the call.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me and for bestowing upon me the honor of kicking off season 3. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. So I guess we could kick off based on my intro. So 5 different regions. So do you mind talking about how you were able to adapt to those various regions through your time? You could go personally, professionally. It's your call on that one. So
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think first and foremost, it's been an absolute pleasure growing up and having lived in different parts of the world, spent some time in Malaysia, Singapore, Korea, Saudi, and then of course in the US as well. And I've done 2 stints here. Pakistan has always been very close to my heart, but I was born in Southeast Asia and spent a lot of time, probably the longest stint of my life, in Malaysia and Singapore. Very diverse from a cultural standpoint compared to life in the West. And I'm often reminded when I travel around the world is 6 out of 7 people don't live in the Western world. And I think that's really important to remember when you're growing up and then, of course, interacting with folks in that part of the region. Singapore itself, where I've spent the longest duration, is certainly a melting pot, right? It's a melting pot, and it's a country that's, I think, just over 50 years old now, with folks with a Malay background, a Chinese background, an Indian background, and then, of course, a massive expat community as well. Singapore is a microcosm of the experiences I've had, having the privilege of working with folks around the world as well. It taught me a lot. Singapore is a very well structured society. It's a society that has thrived. If you look at the span of 50 years, what the country has done to truly transform itself to be a first world country that is thriving in the global ecosystem, it's something to really be marveled at. You think about public infrastructure, safety, education, etc. Singapore was home for a long time, obviously, but then ended up making a few different moves. The transition to Korea was actually with family as well. And Korea was a very different experience, a very singular culture compared to the melting pot of Singapore, but a very rich one and very proud of their heritage. Had a fantastic time over there. It's the first time I've lived in a country with snow. And so certainly, although you are very used to it up in Canada, for somebody who's not spent a lot of time away from the equator, it certainly was a new experience for me. And the thing I took away from Korea was a real pride in their culture. And that's something that I appreciated, an element of respect. There was this big language barrier, but certainly a willingness for folks to still go out of their way to try and help you in whatever way possible. And the respect in that society was something that I admired very much. That followed a move to the Middle East. Again, a very different culture. So coming from mountainous, snowy landscapes of Seoul, Korea, to literally the desert in the eastern province of Saudi. I remember the airport is in a very wilderness sort of area where it is actually one of the largest airports by land area in the world, but it is very secluded from the major cities that it services as well. And the thing about Saudi, I had an amazing experience in my few years there because frankly, it was the center of the world. London was less than 6 hours away. Pakistan was a stone's throw away, so you could have the privilege of going on the long weekend to see family, etc. as well. It was probably the first time that I truly felt Pakistani and the ability to embrace that in a social setting aside from the home setting as well. And I really enjoyed that. I think it was absolutely critical from a character building standpoint. And the ability to interact with Pakistanis, speak the language in public. There often it says that you don't need to know Arabic as much as you need to know Urdu to be successful in Saudi and interact with folks. And at that time, it certainly held true when you're interacting with folks in your daily life. And then obviously the transition to the US. So look, I've done that a couple times. The US is a very different way of life. I think anybody, even in previous episodes of the podcast, can attest to the difference in culture and the amount of adaptation that is required to be settled here in the Western world. But when I think about the journey, first and foremost, I give a huge amount of credit to my family. Living internationally was certainly a privilege. The couple of things that stayed constant was certainly a sense of identity, growing up Pakistani, speaking Urdu, and really embracing that culture. And then the opportunity to visit the country very frequently as well. And for context, even from the US, it feels like an immense privilege to be able to go more than 3 times a year in recent times. But the other thing around embracing that heritage with what you've learned from your global experiences. From Singapore, you learn a lot about a society that is truly transformed in such a short time span and how to live in harmony across religions, across cultural identities to succeed. Korea, there's obviously a sense of respect and their willingness to help despite the language barrier. Then, of course, in the Middle East, what I really liked was the balance that they had between their heritage and obviously the Western world as well, in terms of pride in the religious aspect. And then, of course, wanting to thrive as a society as well. And then, of course, here in the US, and I'm sure we'll get into it a little later, but there's a lot of reward for effort here. But in a nutshell, I think it's also the each of these opportunities, you can make what you want of them. And yeah, all I can say is it's been an absolute privilege to have spent time living around the world. And I feel proud to be able to call myself Pakistani at heart, but certainly a global citizen as well.
Yeah, I think your story is like really interesting because you've been to so many countries, but was there any other aspect that allowed you to really quickly adapt to each, or not each environment, but as overall, I would say?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question. I think the biggest thing around adaptation is when you know that you're going to move, it's trying to build a community very quickly. So I
Yeah,
honestly finding the overseas Pakistanis who are there,
right.
finding other expats who are there, understanding where am I going to live, what will the car or the transport situation look like, do I have the bank account set up, and essentially building a little bit of a checklist. I think the other thing is just being really open-minded. I think in the first couple of moves there was very like, oh, I'm not sure how this is going to end up, but then it's really treating it like an adventure and a privilege, frankly, to be welcomed into a country where you're not from and to embrace that culture and going with a real open mind to say, hey, I want to learn about Malay food, and I'm a big fan of Malay food now. I want to learn about the Korean heritage. I'd love to attend a Korean wedding, for example, or of course in Saudi, just appreciating the customs as well. I think that open minded mentality, again, I give an immense amount of credit to my family for encouraging that. I always say finding the right balance between being strong from a heritage at heart standpoint, but certainly being open minded is very important. And then putting yourself out there and being vulnerable to say, hey, I actually don't know where I'm going to get my groceries in a new city in Saudi Arabia, and I'd love to find somebody who can help me. And more often than not, when you're authentic and vulnerable, folks tend to be very kind and helpful as well. And so my conclusion across the world is there's certainly more good, helpful people than not.
So, in terms of your like experiences in Pakistan, was there any when you went for vacations or anything along those lines? Do you have any stories in Pakistan that you'd like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, as I mentioned, Pakistan has been probably the one constant, despite literal worldwide change, for lack of a better term. I feel immensely privileged to call Pakistan my home in a lot of aspects, and a big attraction is certainly family as well. For me, being welcomed back into Pakistan every single time I visit is something I hold really dear to my heart because no matter where you are, how you're feeling, when you're going, be it scorching heat in the summer or very cold Islamabad winters as well, for someone who grew up around the equator, to be able to be welcomed with such warmth. And I think that's a microcosm of the people there. But certainly, I think the warmth that you get there is something that for me it holds such a special place in my heart. And I'm immensely grateful to my family for always creating that throughout the years and making the trip and making it a priority, regardless of where you are in the world. As I mentioned, it's an absolute privilege, and I feel very blessed to be able to say that. Look, naturally, being Pakistani, food is a big part of
I
our
guess, yeah.
identity, and so more often than not, especially as you grow up and taking your family out to eat as well. It's really coming together around food, different cuisines, even within Pakistan, right? The culture of food in KPK is obviously very different from Sindh and Punjab, and Islamabad really does feel like a melting pot of those cultures, much like the other cities, Karachi, Lahore as well. So food is always fun. So I'm a big fan of trying different cuisine. And then look, lastly, again, look, being Pakistani, I think it's very reminiscent of the culture as well as cricket, right? I love cricket. I've always grown up loving cricket, playing it, watching it as well. And since the PSL, the Pakistani Super League, has come back to Pakistan, it is one of the best sporting spectacles that you can imagine. You're sitting in a stadium with your players, the conversations there around chai, the food that you get is biryani. The conversation takes place with topics that are very relevant to oneself as well. And just having the privilege of being able to attend those matches with family with a lot of passion. These are all very fond memories. But again, I don't think it would be very different for many Pakistanis to really revolve their memories around family, food, and cricket as well.
Yeah, so I think so you briefly mentioned biryani, so I'll put you a little bit on the spot here. What's the go-to that you go when you land to Pakistan?
There was a time where, I could eat nahari for 30 days straight. And in the summer, it fills you up. And in the winter, it keeps you warm. That paired with a good Peshawari kahwa and the equivalent of a green tea is absolutely fantastic to help the meat
Yep.
digest. I'm very bad with vegetables. Aloo and biryani, you call this controversial, but not the biggest fan. But certainly, again, when you eat that amount of meat, you do need to wash it down. Good tea after it for sure.
Awesome. So I guess you did mention, so you moved from the Middle East to the US. So how was that journey like for you?
Yeah, look, it's interesting to think about because again, I've had the honor of moving to the US twice. The first time was for education, and so at that time I moved with family. Our journey to the US as a family was very last minute, frankly. I think 4 months before did we realize that we're moving to the US.
Oh, wow.
We were Singaporeans. We always thought that after our world tour, thanks to my father's profession, that we would move back to Singapore. And then he gets a phone call, and much like our previous moves, we are now preparing for a move to the US. Moving from the Middle East to the US at the time was very tricky. I'd come for my last 2 years of high school and broader education as well. One thing that I remember, especially coming here, is the amount of DIY culture that exists. And
Hmm.
getting used to that, especially having come from the Middle East, was where you had a lot more support, was a real challenge for me personally as well. I think the other thing as well that I reflect upon is trying to fit in the right way. I think you obviously see the US in movies, and you even see high school and university in movies as well. And you think about how do you settle in the right way. I'll be really honest. Initially, I find that challenging. And I think, you're always trying to find the right balance of what I like to call the balance between East and West. A big culture shock, to be very honest, just because life here is different. I think the biggest thing that helped me through that is folks who had done it before, folks who had done it as expats, folks who, like me, came as an international student as well. I think that's really important. I also moved again from Singapore, and I had already seen the US once. And so, having spent some time in the US the first time and then going back to Singapore, basic things like mode of transport, portions. I remember when I first moved back to Singapore, I would order 3x the amount that a normal individual would because I was used to the Texan portions as well. For both pros and cons, the US really values hustle. And if you come here and you work hard and you take advantage of the opportunities and you find those opportunities. There's a lot of reward here. And when I think about the US as a destination, I think that's what makes it so attractive to a lot of folks, including myself. And I think it's then about just building the right sort of community around you to develop the sense of support that you probably would have already had in other countries like Pakistan, or for me, like in Singapore or the Middle East as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I guess we can move on to the actual professional aspect. As you are in the US currently, pretty much relate to all your capability of just adapting to all these new environments. But you started off in engineering and now you are the principal at KFC. So, how do you navigate your career?
I'll go one step back as well. I actually started my career as a sergeant in Singapore's fire and rescue organization before moving to the US the second time. And look, as a mechanical engineer, I never thought I'd be working for KFC. Hand on heart, I can say that, but it's been an absolute privilege to not only spend time here at the global level, but also have had the career transitions as well. None of them were thought out from before. Coming to Texas, you naturally think you're going to grow a career in engineering, manufacturing, energy, etc., as well, and that is going to be your career for the rest of the journey. Uh, for me, a lot of it is actually down to the people that you meet and the folks that you interact with who inspire you and who you aspire to be. And I remember when I started out in engineering, people often ask, why did I do engineering? And the honest answer is because my dad told me, which is a very basic answer. But frankly, I had no interest in the technical aspect. In my technical electives will vouch for that if we ever get to that conversation. But I think it was important. And so I listened to my dad, and
Yeah.
looking back, I don't regret it one bit. Also had the privilege of then putting that into practice and industry as well, working for a few different oil and gas companies, chemical companies, and manufacturers, including Tesla. Just so that I did service to the degree and the point that I needed to ground myself in technical skills. And when you're an international student, I think that's really important so that then you can make the pivot. Business was always an interest of mine, how businesses work, how they operate, what executives think about, etc. And it wasn't until I met a couple of mentors of mine that I learned that a company called McKinsey exists. Because when I started in college and beyond, I had never heard of them. I'd never heard of the profession of consulting. And I had then, just in the interest of learning more, spoken to a few folks, many of whom were Pakistani of origin, to whom I'm in touch with, and they're like family now. But also just thinking through what makes an engineer so effective in the consulting world. And you think about the analytical problem solving skills, breaking down complex problems, and then you marry that with a little bit of industry experience. And then it makes you very relevant for a client to help them solve through their challenges. So, look, at McKinsey, I spent a lot of time around corporate strategy, digital strategy, customer experience, and tech transformation, and in a variety of industries, including energy, core tech, so think software companies, and then also in the food and beverage space. And for me, I always thought of McKinsey, or the way McKinsey was advertised to me was it was a launching pad or a career accelerator. And the amount of learning that I had in my few years there was absolutely tremendous. It's funny because I had tried to get into McKinsey, I think, 3, 4 times over a number of years. And for whatever reason, unfortunately, couldn't even make the interview round. And then here comes the last time where I didn't tell anybody that I was applying. And much to my surprise, just because it was out of habit, not only do I receive an invitation to move forward, but I receive an invite and I actually have 5 days to prepare. If you're familiar with the consulting world, casing is a big part of the interview process. And a lot of the relationships that I had developed previously, I had to call them up and say, hey, I didn't tell you that I applied this year, but I did. And my interview is in 5 days. And would you be willing to run a case with me? And it was probably the most stressful week at the time in my life, where I was trying to be ready for what seemed like a really hard interview. So, had the support from not only the overseas Pakistani community in consulting, but others who I had the privilege of chatting with and who were kind enough to mentor me as well. And so the iterative improvement around each of my cases over those 5 days was thankfully enough to sneak through and successfully interview and land a job offer. So even the journey to get there is certainly one that is memorable for me. But the learning was absolutely tremendous. Serving clients on these topics across industries, you learn so much, not only from a functional standpoint, but also across industries to think about what are the right questions to ask? How do you find the balance between vulnerability and credibility to ask the right questions about a new industry, but also show that you have what it takes to not only help your clients succeed, but also grow talent and capabilities internally and externally as well. And a lot of it, even across consulting and the transition to consulting as well, is really around relationships and mentorship. So I hand on heart, I can say that I wouldn't be at KFC today or at McKinsey or have had the engineering experiences that I did if it wasn't for the relationships and the mentors who were kind enough to extend their time, their insight, their wisdom my way. And I think it starts off with family. I think obviously now I would consider my father a mentor because, and I'm glad I took his advice for starting engineering, but just taking that thread and continuing it on with other folks that you learn from as well. And then look, the story from McKinsey to KFC is the same thing. McKinsey touts itself on its alumni network. And I was actually really curious to see, all right, so what does that look like? And it's amazing. I still remember it to this day. I reached out to a gentleman who I had always thought that I'd go into tech. And a lot of the time that I spend in digital now is applicable. But obviously, like I mentioned, as a mechanical engineer, I never thought I'd be at KFC. And I had actually reached out to folks, moved on from McKinsey, and were doing really interesting things. And I sent a message to this gentleman on LinkedIn who was kind enough to then become a mentor of mine, but he had gone from McKinsey to Google to KFC as well. And I actually asked him, I said, what attracted you to KFC after a very successful career not at McKinsey and at Google? And the first thing I remember is when I sent this LinkedIn message, he replied within 30 seconds. He's a C-level leader. He was a C-level leader. That meant so much to me because for somebody to go out of their way and take the time to reply, it gives you a lot of motivation to say there are people out there who are really willing to help even at the most senior levels. And that's something that I really appreciate and I hold very dear to my heart. We hopped on a call. We literally hopped on a call and I asked him this question. And he said, it's a fantastic experience to help shape the future on a truly global scale. So if you think about KFC, 150 countries, 30,000 restaurants. If you think about making an impact across the world, this is a great platform to be able to do it. And not only was his personality, his charm, and obviously he's willing to chat so quickly inspiring to me, but just that notion of truly having a global impact, that was certainly inspiring. And look, it's a privilege to be in a role where you can see the difference that one makes. And so, yeah, what started off as mentorship ended up being an invitation to join the company. And it's been a couple of years now at KFC, and the leaders are continue to be what we like to describe as high performing and very heart led. And the culture is very reminiscent of that. And I feel very lucky to be a part of it.
If you were to take a step back and go back to in that moment, like how did you get over the fact that, oh, I'm switching a sector or I'm switching jobs? Like, how did you say that, okay, I can do this? How was your mindset? Do you remember? And what pushed you to go forward?
Yeah, look, I remember it very well. And I think there are two things. And I'll go back to one is around relationships and folks who have believed in you for a number of years. And as you continue to chat with folks, I think those relationships are really important because they've seen the progress, they've seen the development, and obviously if those are the people that inspire you and they have enough belief in you, you naturally grow in confidence and then obviously seek their advice in terms of what are good questions to ask, what are things that I should learn about beforehand, what are things I should be mindful of as well. I think the other thing when it comes to making each of these pivots is actually keeping one thing constant. Certainly the industry pivot is vast in this case, but I would
Yeah.
certainly say that kept in certain elements and certain transitions, I've actually kept the functions similar. So I'll give you an example, right? What being a sergeant in Singapore's fire and rescue organization taught me was high pressure leadership, character building, because you are literally dealing with lives on the line. And also had the privilege of doing some work with the UN on international disaster management. So really taking a lot of those program and project management skills, right? Marrying them with a little bit of technical acumen from what you learn in engineering and applying it with it industry. And then taking the engineering, what I like to call analytical problem solving industry experience and starting to serve clients in the manufacturing and energy space as well. Across each of those pivots, and this is a big value prop of consulting, is if you keep the function similar, so be it corporate strategy or digital strategy, the basic principles that you apply in solving a problem across industries is probably 80% similar. And I think
Okay.
that's really important to understand. So if you stick to those fundamentals from a functional standpoint, you can go and answer those questions in tech or in the food and beverage space as well. And through my McKinsey journey, there had always been, or they had started to evolve an element of digital and technology. Like I said, digital transformations, tech transformations, customer experience, et cetera. And so I was actually the broader mandate of the role, or a big chunk of the role that when I first came in was helping KFC grow its digital transactions globally. And that is very much a digital transformation. And so helping obviously on broader business challenges as well as it relates to sustainability and whatnot. But I think keeping that functional piece constant was actually very helpful in my transition from consulting to the food and beverage or the quick service restaurant space as well. So when you think about the story, there are certain elements of similarities that you latch on to from an element of credibility to be able to think about what are the right questions to ask, what is the right knowledge that I'm bringing across. And then obviously, I think it's people that value a diversity in perspective. I think that's really important, finding those sort of people, because an outside in perspective is very useful, whether that's somebody who has come from an energy background into the food and beverage space, or somebody who has done a variety of different things functionally within an industry as well. So I think those two things, certainly around the relationships, keeping one thing constant and then really embracing the diversity in perspectives, were certainly helpful as I thought through each of those transitions. But a lot of them were down to people, inspiring
Right.
people who had done a transition like that, and who not only do you get along with, but you want to learn from and emulate as well.
Awesome. And I know you briefly talked about your stint in McKinsey as well, KFC, but in terms of getting the role in Tesla, how was that process like? Was that you got through networking or you just applied similar to McKinsey, or what was the process for that?
I think at the time there was a lot of growth in Texas. Tesla was looking to build out their Austin Gigafactory, and a lot of the previous engineering experiences across a variety of roles certainly helped. I'll be honest, I applied online and
Oh,
had
okay.
the privilege of receiving an interview and then spending a brief amount of time there. It's an amazing place. The way in which they grow and they build, for me, I had always worked in asset heavy organizations prior, capital intensive, but the modularity in construction and the pace at which they worked was certainly something that I took a ton from. And actually, some of those skills were very applicable in the consulting world where things move very quickly as well. So the short answer is I applied online and it does work, but I've
Okay. Yeah.
obviously thought about the ratio around to what extent that is successful. McKinsey was no
Okay.
different.
Gotcha.
I applied online there the last year that I was offered to invite. I didn't tell any of my mentors before I applied. I didn't tell anybody because I had applied a few years in a row. And this time I decided, since I do it every year, I might as well do it this
There's a
time.
do
And,
for that.
and I guess I got lucky.
Was there any differences that you did in terms of the application, or was it just exact same, but just worked out? Did you make any changes throughout the time you actually got it versus the other three or four?
It's a fantastic question. I think one thing that certainly helped me was, while that had been a North Star, once I had learned about consulting, the ability to continue to build the profile out.
Right.
Obviously, the year before I had applied to McKinsey, I didn't have Tesla on the resume, didn't have some other companies. So how do you go about continuing to improve your profile? From a diversity of experiences standpoint, I think was very beneficial, because other than that, it was a resume drop, and the resume is what changed, and it just continued to grow and develop. Even if you have a North Star and you feel there are certain hurdles that are stopping you from getting there, just being conscientious and mindful of the fact that as long as you continue to build upon the profile, you never know how and when that'll happen.
Got you. And I guess moving to McKinsey, how did you successfully progress yourself in the actual job and in the company itself?
I'm going to start off with people. People
Oh,
were
okay.
kind enough to help. McKinsey prides itself on apprenticeship, which I think is it's a signature to the McKinsey consulting world as well. I think there's also got to be a lot of passion there. The opportunity to help clients solve some of the most complex problems that they're thinking through, it's a privilege. It really is. And the ability to partner with them is very important. The vision of McKinsey is of delivering impact both to our client and then our people individually as well. So how do you help grow folks within the company through receiving apprenticeship, but then obviously very quickly giving it as well? And then really partnering with your clients, right? I think having the partnership mindset is really important because you are not coming in as a savior, for lack of a better term. It is a partnership. And how do you think through problems together? How do you embrace diversity and perspective? How do you respect each other's opinion with the common goal that we want to find a solution that's best for you? And I learned a lot of that from inspiring personalities, inspiring values, and then doing a lot of really interesting things on the side as well. So I'll give you one example. Once a year, McKinsey brings together America's top Muslim executives for something called Muslim Executive Forum. The ability to help and participate in that from the staff side was amazing. And again, it's a privilege, and I think it's a responsibility that should be taken very wisely. You can learn a lot from those, whether that's serving a client or helping on diversity initiatives as well. And those are some of the things that I remember most fondly. But of course, when you're putting in the hours, and they can be long hours, it's building really strong and trusting relationships, learning about folks from different cultures because you're more often than not, your team can be very global, learning about different industries, and then building a lot of memories in those long hours. Going through tough times together builds a stronger bond. And I think not only is that reminiscent in life, but it was reminiscent at McKinsey as well. And I feel very lucky to have interacted with some amazing folks who, many of whom I'm still friends with today.
Awesome. So I guess from your time at McKinsey, you eventually moved into KFC, and that's through, obviously you previously mentioned about networking and being able to leverage your connections as well for that. So in terms of your time at KFC, how did you develop yourself even further? And in terms of as being a leader, like how did you manage global opportunity, the risks associated with the role itself?
Yeah, the first thing I'll tell you is I didn't reach out to that gentleman with the intention of landing a role. I wanted to
Yeah.
learn what about that transition was so interesting. And I guess the learning mindset helped me even in the transition and in this role. Look, I think learning a new industry, you always think through what are the right questions that you should ask. And the franchise business model is, I like to describe it as B to B to C. So if you have B2B experience or B2C experience, you're halfway there. But then naturally, the nuances of a franchise business are very intricate and can be very challenging as well. I think a lot of it is, and look, you'll hear these words throughout now, and as I'm noticing the theme is asking the questions from a place of vulnerability to say, hey, can you explain to me what you do, whether whether you're asking a specific business unit or specific region of the world, or a business function at corporate as well. Just understanding what are the challenges that each region or function is facing, and then thinking through how can you help as part of that. Naturally, you have your own KPIs and targets and whatnot, but I think coming from with that learning mindset is very important because then you build a sense of trust that shows that you understand some of the challenges as well. I also feel very privileged. The international background that I had, having lived in 5 different countries, being an expat around the world, that's something that has helped me immensely in a global role. And I always like to say that one of the most important things to acknowledge are the regional and cultural implications of decision making. It's
Okay.
such an important thing to think through whether you're investing, opening new stores, running a new business, transforming, coming out of a challenging period. And I think that is very important because not only does it build a sense of empathy with the people that you're working with, but it also builds a sense of empathy and understanding around the business challenges that you're dealing with. And then when you think about the role of digital, and this is something I'm very passionate about, it's with the North Star of trying to ensure better experiences for a guest. And I think doing so is very valuable. And the opportunity to see that change day to day from region to region and see that grow and see customers continue to be satisfied with the experience. Because at the end of the day, that's what they come into a restaurant for. As well as the food, right? And as KFC in Pakistan is very tasty, so I'm a big fan of it. But I think at the end of the day, it's about trying to improve experiences for guests and for our team members. And when you see the impact that has around the world, it is extremely heartening.
So, in terms of within KFC, allowing for mentoring and upcoming professionals as well, like how has that process been for you within KFC?
I think first and foremost, it's been very rewarding. Obviously, I benefited so much from seeing inspiring leaders, chatting with folks who I admired from a value standpoint, from a achievement standpoint, a character standpoint as well. It's a privilege to be able to give back and help grow capabilities and talent. It's interesting, McKinsey often publishes that the two things most top of mind for leaders are talent and then geopolitical considerations as well. And if you can help uplift talent, for me, I think it's very rewarding, but I also think it's a responsibility for you to continue to give back and help others grow in a similar facet. So I find it very rewarding. I think the second thing as well is, and when you think about that responsibility, it's very important to acknowledge what are they after? Everybody has a slightly different North Star or definition for success. For some, it's around finding the right balance between work life, etc. For some, it's excelling in the role that they're in. For some, it's a desire to grow very quickly. For some, it's learning a new skill. And I think it's very important to understand how you can help that person clarify what their North Star is and then go and help them achieve that. Everybody, like I mentioned, views success differently. And so I think it's important to appreciate that. And when it came to giving mentorship, that it also broadens your horizon. So more often than not, I would hear that mentorship is a two-way street. Helping folks build capabilities is always a two-way street. Reason being is because not only are you honing your skills, your guidance, your advice, but you're helping them grow as well. And with each person that you interact with, that diversity and perspective is something that you always learn from. And so I love to hear what's top of mind of the next generation of talent. I find it always very helpful when you think through setting a vision of your team, setting a vision and culture of your team, and your broader efforts as well.
Awesome. So I guess we did talk about young and upcoming professionals. So in terms of speaking to your younger self, would there be any advice you would give to your younger self, if any, and why?
Oh gosh, a great question. I think the first one is be yourself. Often, especially when I came to the States the first time, it was always, how do I need to behave in order to fit in? Right? It's important to be yourself, but it's also important to be your best self and continuing to work on that as well. I think the other piece of advice is embrace the challenge of being an international student as well. I'll tell you from experience and then through mentorship that is probably 50 times harder being an international student trying to find the right sort of employment opportunities in this country because of sponsorship challenges and whatnot. But I'll tell you one thing, there's probably no more resilient a group of people than international students because of that. And the more senior you become, the more that diversity and perspective, your international experiences continue to benefit. And I think embracing that rather than thinking, oh my God, I'm an international student, this is so hard. And developing that mindset shift is really important.
Okay. So in terms of the key habits that you feel that's allowed you to be successful and reach the point you are today, what would they be?
Three things for me, they were always around faith, effort, and intention. Faith is a big part of who I am. For me, around effort and intention, understanding the why around that and how that's beneficial, making sure that is really important. And then the effort piece is once you're interested in something or you put your 110%. I always say in my mentorship, I will invest as much as a mentee does in the relationship, and it's really rewarding because if that relationship is very strong, it's a privilege to be able to see those people grow, develop, land amazing roles, and then continue to pass it forward as well. And then look, I think the big overlay on top of that is sincere and genuine relationships, continuing to build upon those. And when I reached out to folks to try and land jobs, those relationships were very short term and they felt a little transactional. When you come from a place of I want to learn about your career journey, and I want to understand why you made the decisions that you did or how you got to this place, and you come from a learning mindset and with sincere intentions in that space, the value of those relationships over a period of years far transcends a referral that may get rejected.
Right.
Because not only do they become, for lack of a better word, trusted council of advisors on many different things, right? Personal life, work life balance, a specific industry or a specific business challenge. But also then when it comes to thinking through where you are and what you want to do, I think those sincere and genuine relationships can be very uplifting when you're going through a difficult time as well. And I feel very lucky, very privileged, very blessed to be a recipient of those relationships. And I'm frankly a very big advocate that I tell folks in mentorship as well, that having the learning mindset and coming from a place of I'd love to learn about your career journey rather than hey, can you give me a referral because I'm interested in this
Yeah.
job? The value of
Yeah.
that relationship far transcends a potential referral for sure.
Awesome. So yeah, these are the last two questions there. So how do you define success?
One of the things that my father told me when I first got into McKinsey, and I really felt on top of the world because it was such a hard place to get into and over a number of years. He actually told me, look, it doesn't matter the job title. And he said it in Urdu, so it sounds much more eloquent in Urdu, but he said that it doesn't matter what job title you have or how much money you're earning, but the greatest satisfaction or sense of fulfillment that you have is the opportunity and when you're able to help others. And I see it. I still remember the first day that I got into McKinsey. I remember getting the offer call. It was outside my garage, and I was so stressed and I felt on top of the world. But then having the privilege of helping others land the same role, oh, it's 10x, 100x the feeling because you've been an enabler on somebody's journey, and that's a blessing in itself. So I think I've always continued to try and anchor success on that. The goal for me is trying to impact folks' lives in a positive way, be that personal or professional. And that's the North Star that I have. I think success, it varies for everybody. When I started my career, I always thought I wanted to grow quickly. For me now, success is finding the people that you enjoy working with, rather. And I think that's very important from a professional standpoint because when you're happy, your culture is strong, and you've got strong bonds and you've developed them and you continue to develop them, then not only does your productivity, but your happiness quotient increases quite a bit. I think the second thing for me as you grow up as well is look, those personal relationships are very important. Like I said, Pakistan being such a constant in a life that I would probably underscore has been defined by change. I think continuing to be able to see family, see friends, and be regular about that is very important. If I ever reach a point where I feel that, yes, have more than enough of these sort of sincere and genuine relationships, both in a personal and professional capacity, that's how I would define success.
Awesome. And I guess we can end this off with a question that was posed from the previous interview to ask pretty much yourself. So,
Sure.
what are the one or two things you've learned about yourself on this journey?
The human is more resilient than you think. It's funny because growing up, when we were going through a lot of these changes, my father would often use the elastic band terminology where you stretch the elastic band to a certain point and then you hold it there. And that is its new norm. And obviously, there are mechanical engineering principles that define it as well. I think the other thing that I wish I had fully acknowledged is the impact that family has. So I've mentioned my father a lot of times, but when you're going through tough times, extended family, whenever you go home, having a hot meal made by your mother is better than any sort of five-star restaurant. Family is the sort of community, and family is the backbone of that is always there to help you when you're going through a difficult situation. And I think that's something that I appreciate a lot. And family can be whatever you make it out to be, can be a circle of friends that have become family. And how often do we use the term family, friends, and literally mean it like family? Even in Urdu, right? You don't call an auntie when they're very close, you call them khala. And I think that in itself is a fantastic embodiment that I wish I had acknowledged sooner. It had always been something you grow up with, but I think once you fully understand the importance of that, right, it brings a very real perspective into life. And it's been something that I spend a lot of time reflecting on as you try and help the next generation as well.
Awesome. Like you talked about so many different topics from your experience in 5 different areas, all the way to your experiences at Tesla, KFC, McKinsey, and all the personal advice you gave to up and coming professionals. So thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you for having me, Azam. I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic. So again, it's a blessing to be invited onto your show and hopefully have something that is helpful for folks to hear.
Awesome.